Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly has always stood out to me as one of those rare games that transcends the boundaries of simple horror and becomes something far more enduring, almost mythic in its legacy. As someone who has admired the genre from the sidelines, forever curious, forever intrigued, but admittedly too easily frightened to dive fully into the darkest corners of its worlds, there is an undeniable aura about Fatal Frame 2 that commands respect. It is not only one of the most terrifying JRPG horror experiences ever crafted, but also one of the most emotionally resonant, a game that uses a supernatural premise not just to scare, but to tell a hauntingly human story about love, sacrifice and tragedy. That combination of deep narrative and chilling atmosphere is precisely why, even decades later, it continues to linger in conversations whenever people speak about the pinnacle of JRPG horror gaming. What makes Fatal Frame 2 so unique is its ability to blend JRPG-like storytelling with deeply unsettling mechanics that force the player into vulnerability. Unlike other horror games that hand you weapons or allow you to flee in moments of panic, Fatal Frame 2 arms you with nothing more than the Camera Obscura, a tool that requires you to look directly into the eyes of the horror you're facing. For someone like me who has always loved JRPGs for their character-driven arcs and world building, this mechanic feels both cruel and brilliant. You can't avoid the terror, you have to embrace it, stare it down, and engage with it in the most intimate way possible. It's the kind of design that not only heightens the fear, but also underscores the game's thematic core, that horror is as much about confronting the past, the hidden, and the unresolved as it is about trying to survive. What cements Fatal Frame 2's long-lasting legacy, however, is its atmosphere, a perfect blend of folkloric dread and quiet melancholy that no other game has fully ever replicated. Every frame of the abandoned village feels steeped in ritual and memory. Every shadow lingers with the weight of what once was, and every ghost carries with it a sorrow that feels profoundly human. It's not just about jump scares or grotesque imagery, it's about an overwhelming sense of sadness and inevitability that sticks with you long after the controller has been put down and the credits fade to black. Even for someone like me, too scared to play most horror games, be they JRPG or otherwise, I can still appreciate from a distance the artistry at work here. How Fatal Frame 2 turns fear into beauty and how it manages to capture both the heart and the spine in equal measure, that's why it remains, to this day, one of the finest JRPG horror games ever made. Hey, if you like what you see, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that noti bell because it really helps out. At the heart of Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly are its protagonists Mio and Mayu Amakura, whose relationship is not only the emotional anchor of the game, but also its most compelling draw. Unlike many horror titles where characters are little more than vessels for the player's fear, Mio and Mayu are richly layered, defined by their shared past and the complex dynamic between protective younger sister and fragile elder sister. Mayu's physical weakness and vulnerability weigh heavily on Mio, who becomes both her caretaker and her tether to the world beyond the accursed village. This sisterly bond is more than just a narrative window dressing, it is the essence of Fatal Frame 2's horror, because every haunting, every fleeting shadow, every ritualistic whisper is filtered through the lens of their connection. You are not simply fighting to survive, you're fighting to preserve the bond between two souls who could just as easily be torn apart by supernatural cruelty as by the strain of their very own choices. What makes this setup uniquely powerful is how the game weaponizes empathy, something few horror games dared to do at the time. Instead of relying solely on external monsters or gore, Fatal Frame 2's true terror comes from the possibility of losing someone you love, not in a cinematic cutscene, but through choices and events that weigh directly on the player's shoulders. It taps into a primal kind of fear, the kind that comes from knowing you might not be able to protect the one person you hold dearest, no matter how desperately you may try. For someone like me who admires JRPGs for their deep emotional storytelling and character-driven stakes, this makes Fatal Frame 2's narrative approach feel instantly recognizable, yet wholly unique within the horror genre. The journey of Mio and Mayu is not unlike the sprawling epics of traditional JRPGs where bonds between characters are tested by overwhelming odds, but here the battlefield is stripped of armies and magic, replaced instead by dim lantern-lit corridors and the oppressive silence of a village that feels alive with so many secrets. The game's USP, or unique selling point, the now iconic Camera Obscura, perfectly complements this emotional framework by making horror personal, intimate, and unavoidably direct. Unlike firearms or swords, the camera demands stillness, composure, and courage in the face of unearthly terror. The ghosts are not abstract enemies to be dispatched from a distance, they must be confronted up close through a literal lens, forcing the player to steady themselves and engage with fear in its rawest form. It is a mechanic that captures what Fatal Frame 2 is all about, the act of seeing what you'd rather not see, of facing truths that would be easier to ignore. When paired with the bond between Mio and Mayu, the Camera Obscura transforms from a mere gameplay device into a narrative symbol. It is a way of holding onto fleeting fragments of a world that is already slipping into shadow, just as Mio desperately holds onto her sister despite the inevitability of loss. This combination of human vulnerability, innovative mechanics, and emotional depth is what has solidified Fatal Frame 2's reputation as not just another generic horror title, but a landmark in JRPG horror storytelling. The lore of Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly is perhaps its most defining and unforgettable quality, a dense tapestry of folklore, ritual, and tragedy that lingers like a curse in the player's imagination. Unlike many horror titles that simply drape their scares over a thin narrative skeleton, Fatal Frame 2 builds its world around an intricate mythos that feels ancient, lived in, and terrifyingly plausible. The game's central setting, the Lost Village, exists not only as just a mere backdrop, but as a character within its own right, haunted by its own history and the blood-soaked rituals that doomed its inhabitants. The Crimson Sacrifice ritual, where one twin must strangle the other to appease the abyss, serves as the foundation for both the village's tragic downfall and the Amakura sisters' haunting parallels. It is lore steeped in themes of love twisted by obligation, tradition turned into torment, and humanity eroded by superstition. The chilling detail is not just in the ritual itself, but in how it echoes across every broken home, every lingering ghost, and every whispered memory that the player must uncover. What makes the lore so profoundly effective is the way that it is unveiled. It isn't dumped onto the player in exposition-heavy dialogue or monologues, but rather pieced together through diaries, photographs, ghostly encounters, and the village's physical decay. Every crumbling corridor and forgotten shrine feels like a page of history written in ash and blood, waiting for the player to unearth and interpret. This fragmented storytelling style mirrors the experience of uncovering a suppressed and hidden past, where truth must emerge, but only in fragments, and the horror lies not in sudden revelations, but in the slow dawning realization of what truly happened. The more you learn, the heavier the atmosphere becomes, as if the very act of uncovering these truths is drawing you deeper into the same fate that consumed the very villages themselves. In this way, the lore is not just a narrative device, but a gameplay mechanic in and of itself, rewarding curiosity while simultaneously punishing it with a deeper sense of dread. The genius of Fatal Frame 2's lore lies in its ability to marry the supernatural with the profoundly human. On the surface, it is a tale of restless spirits and demonic abysses, but beneath it all is the story of a community that allowed fear, ancient traditions, and a blind faith to eclipse compassion. The ritual that once promised salvation becomes an engine of despair, and the village, once vibrant, became a mausoleum of its own hubris. This layered mythology not only heightens the game's horror, but also elevated it beyond the realm of ghost story into something that feels like a cultural memory, a legend you could imagine being whispered about in hushed tones long before the game ever even existed. For someone like me, who has always admired JRPGs for their ability to create worlds where lore feels essential to the experience, Fatal Frame 2 stands out as a masterclass. Its myths are not window dressing, they are the bones of the story, the heartbeat of the horror, and the reason its spectral echoes continue to haunt players long after the final frame fades to black. If there is one element that defines Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly beyond just its haunting story, it is the interplay of its gameplay and atmosphere. two forces that work in tandem to create one of the most chilling experiences in gaming history. When most horror titles rely on either brute force mechanics or predictable shock tactics, Fatal Frame 2 dares to immerse the player in a slow, suffocating dread, transforming every step through the Lost Village into an ordeal of tension. The pacing is deliberate, demanding players to linger in spaces that most games would have you rush through, and this choice amplifies the sensation of being trapped in a world that breathes, whispers, and watches you. It is not just a matter of what you do, but how you feel while doing it, and Fatal Frame 2 ensures that every mechanic is tied directly to its oppressive, melancholic mood. The gameplay's most infamous feature, the aforementioned USP of Fatal Frame 2, the Camera Obscura, is not only a unique tool, but also the very embodiment of the game's atmosphere. Unlike guns or melee weapons, which create distance between player and foe, this camera manages to force you into an intimate space with the specters that stalk you. It is an almost perverse inversion of comfort to attack a ghost. You must stare at it, frame it, and hold steady until the last possible second for maximum effect. This design choice heightens the tension to unbearable levels, because every second spent focusing your shot is a second closer to the ghost reaching you. Yet, paradoxically, this vulnerability is what makes each successful exorcism so satisfying. Not in the sense of domination, but of narrowly escaping terror by sheer willpower. It is this vulnerability, paired with the precision and timing, that places Fatal Frame 2's gameplay firmly within the horror tradition while giving it the depth and deliberation of a JRPG system. Layered over those mechanics is an atmosphere so thick and meticulously crafted that it becomes the true antagonist of the game itself. The Lost Village is suffused with silence, punctuated by distant wails, creaking wood, and the faint rustle of spectral movement just beyond sight. The architecture itself is oppressive, with its labyrinthian shrines rotting tatami mats and corridors bathed in dim flickering light, evoking not only fear, but also an overwhelming sadness, as if the very walls themselves mourn the lives lost within them. Fatal Frame 2 understands that horror is not just about what leaps out from the shadows, but about what the shadows themselves can and do represent: the unknown, the forgotten, and the unresolved. Each room you enter is a story in decay, each ghost encounter is a reminder of the cost of the rituals, and every step forward a deeper descent into sorrow. The result is a game that doesn't just scare, it consumes you, wrapping you in a cloak of dread so palpable that it lingers long after the console is switched off. Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly endures not only as a standout horror game, but as a benchmark for how deeply interactive storytelling can intertwine perfectly with mechanics, atmosphere, and lore to create an experience that transcends its very own genre. Its protagonists, Mio and Mayu, are more than just vessels of fear, they are the embodiments of emotional stakes that elevate the narrative into something unforgettable. The tragic lore of the Crimson Sacrifice ritual, revealed through fragmented whispers and decaying spaces, serves as one of gaming's most haunting mythologies, rooting its horror in themes of love, loss, and the destructive weight of tradition. Coupled with the Camera Obscura, a gameplay innovation that forced intimacy with terror, Fatal Frame 2 has set itself apart from every other horror title of its time and carved out a legacy that few have managed to rival since. Its impact on JRPGs lies not just in its direct imitation, but in inspiration. It demonstrated that horror could be more than shock value or gore, it could be character-driven, emotionally resonant, and built on the same narrative richness that defined RPGs. By blending the structural DNA of JRPG storytelling with mechanics that demanded vulnerability and attention, Fatal Frame 2 showed that both fear and empathy could coexist, and that horror could just be as much about the heart as it was about the spine. This rather perfect balance has influenced countless titles that followed, from indie psychological horror games to larger franchises that began placing greater emphasis on atmosphere and emotional stakes. Even today, the game's atmosphere remains unrivaled, its sadness and beauty resonating just as strongly as its fear. It is a title that lingers not only in the memory, but in the DNA of the genre, a reminder of what happens when storytelling, mechanics, and setting are fused with both artistry and care. For someone like me, too scared or intimidated to play most horror games, be they RPG, JRPG, or otherwise, but I am also endlessly fascinated by their craft, Fatal Frame 2 stands as a masterpiece I can't help but revere from both near and far. Its legacy is proof that horror, when done right, is truly timeless, an echo that refuses to fade, much like the Crimson Butterflies themselves.